Devastating floods in Europe, wildfires in the Arctic, and record heat waves in Canada and the U.S. Scientists say climate change will make extreme weather events even more frequent. So, how should we and our governments adapt to the new reality? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Scientists have long warned that climate change will lead to more extreme weather. We've seen 3 examples just this week. Devastating flash floods in Europe, wildfires in Siberia, and the U.S. and Canada are facing another heat wave. At least 150 people have died in what's being called once-in-a-century floods across Western Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Rescuers are scrambling to find more than 1,000 people who are still missing. Fast-moving floodwaters swept away cars, submerged villages, and triggered landslides. Some areas recorded more than double the average rainfall for July in just 24 hours.
The water was still here. We tried to get in the house and get everything up on the highest point in the house. So, and then we just grabbed also some stuff that we could see that we knew, okay, this is important, and then we just left. People are saying that this might happen for now every 5-10 years or something like that. So I'm not sure. I mean, we try to learn from this, I think.
It was so scary to see the water rise. My car in the garage is totally destroyed. There was water all the way up to here.
I don't think we could have predicted it would happen. We might have expected that the water could rise higher, but not so high that a river virtually went through Falkenberg. It's just bizarre.
In Russia, the army is sending planes to put out wildfires in one of the coldest places on Earth. 800,000 hectares of forests have been burned in Siberia. Although wildfires happen every year, scientists say they've become more intense because of unusually high temperatures across the tundra. Wildfires are also sweeping across the western regions of Canada and the United States. A fire in Oregon larger than the size of New York City has been burning for 9 days. Forecasters say the wildfires will lead to the region's 4th heat wave in 5 weeks, with temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius. All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. In London, Tim Forsyth, Professor of Environment and Development at the London School of Economics and Political Science. In Lund, Sweden, Emily Boyd, Director of Lund University's Center for Sustainability Studies and a Professor of Sustainability Science. And in Vancouver, Simon Donner, Professor of Climatology at the University of British Columbia. A warm welcome to you all, and thanks for joining us on Inside Story today. Simon, let me start with you today. Just please talk our viewers through how exactly you go from global warming to then flooding on this scale. What does that process look like?
Well, as the planets are warming, the atmosphere is able to hold more water. It's just physics. The more water, the warmer the air is, the greater the capacity is to hold water. People can learn that in physics class at our university. And so it works out that for about every degree of warming, there's on average around 6 to 7% more water in the air, 6 to 7% more water in the air. And so it usually is going to mean you're going to see more extreme rainfall as the planet's been warming. Now, whether we can connect that to an individual flood event, that's complicated, of course, because flooding depends on all sorts of other factors about the landscape. But the rainfall, these incredibly unusual rainfall, record-breaking rainfall we've seen in Western Europe, certainly has a climate signal in it.
Emily, whether they are floods in Western Europe that we're talking about or wildfires in North America, the sad reality that we're faced with in this day and age is that we should be expecting more of these weather extremes as the planet continues to heat up, right?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, according to the climate scientists, this is what our future holds for us. So therefore, it's really important that we engage with the science now to really understand the effects of these extremes and how they particularly going to affect the most vulnerable in our societies across the world.
Yeah, Emily, let me follow up with you on that, because it's one thing when these extreme weather events happen in wealthier countries, but it's something else entirely when they happen in poorer or underdeveloped countries. What kind of an impact is climate change having on these poorer countries?
Well, in particular, the effects will be on the most disproportionately marginalized, or those living in poverty and extreme poverty, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa. But it's not just simply the effects of climate change on, let's say, food security. It's a compounding effect we talk about. So the compounding effect on the risks of the everyday challenges that people face in their lives. So it's also about creating good development, as well as thinking about climate change and the effects of the hazards of climate change.
Tim, how can cities and society start to adapt and prepare for these extreme climate events? I mean, what can cities do with regard to whether it be urban planning or infrastructure to reduce the risk of, say for now, flooding?
Well, basically, there are two pathways to take. One is to take the water away from the cities, or the second is to take the people away from the water when it comes to a flood. Obviously, you can do both at the same time. I mean, there have been places in Europe where they have had incidences of flash flooding, which can sometimes be very unexpected. And the infrastructure that has been built has been large concrete drainage systems to remove the water when it happens very quickly. It's quite often that you see cities in like the mountain regions of Italy, for example, which have got a tiny little stream running through the middle, but they're located in a large channel which might have like plants growing and rocks, and it looks very attractive. But the purpose of that wider channel is to make sure that in the event of a large flood from the mountains, then the channel can cope with those larger quantities. But also at the same time, you can also engage with people and planning to maybe shut down certain areas of a city at a time when the authorities believe that there is a high risk of flooding, or to educate people about what to do in the event of a high risk period, those sorts of things.
Simon, scientists are saying, and they've been saying for a while now, that governments must both cut the carbon emissions that are fueling extreme events and that they also must prepare better for extreme weather. Obviously, we've heard this many times in the past. Are governments going to finally start heeding these warnings?
Well, every time we have an extreme weather event like this, certainly weather events like this that are fatal, governments, individuals, businesses, everybody responds. I do think we have to be careful about assuming that an extreme event is going to inspire the world to action. And I think one of the challenges is, we've said that before. We thought, oh, Hurricane Katrina, when it hit New Orleans, that was going to inspire everyone to action. Hurricane Sandy, when it hit New York City, would do it. And really, I think the challenge here is that it's not just about running away from the impacts of climate change. We need to run to, a future where we've got, lower carbon emissions, and which we've adapted. And so I think it's about running towards the solutions as much as running away from the impacts of climate change. And one example I think of, given the heat waves we've experienced here in Vancouver in British Columbia, is one of the most important solutions for our buildings to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is the shift from using natural gas for heating to using electric heat pumps. So that's both a good idea for reducing emissions, but also that would provide air conditioning, a way to cool all of these buildings that don't have it today. So it sort of does a little bit of both.
Tim, I saw you nodding along to some of what Simon was saying there. It looked to me like you wanted to jump in, so please go ahead.
Not necessarily. I'm just agreeing that the interesting thing that we will witness in the next couple of weeks will be the political reaction to this. I know that in Europe, for example, they passed the adaptation strategy in the EU, the European Union, earlier this year. Although that still needs to be fleshed out, I think these events will have great impetus for shaping what the adaptation strategy will be. But it is also crucial that we get it right, that we don't simply respond to just short-term crises, but instead look at this as an opportunity to start thinking in a joined-up way between like energy policy, but also how people live with risk at the same time. It's not just about climate change adaptation or mitigation, but both together in acceptable ways.
Emily, from your vantage point, what are some of the concrete steps that need to be taken so that societies and governments can really start to adapt to this new reality?
Well, I would say first and foremost, like taking a step back, we obviously need to mitigate and tackle emissions. That's like the most important thing, and take action on that and fulfill the Paris Agreement. Now, we're all going to have to adapt no matter what. So there are a range of very practical approaches to that. I mean, ranging from some of the physical changes to infrastructure and planning and so on that Tim and Simon have mentioned, but also really important is this public awareness and the educational side. So for people to understand, not just we might need to learn from this, as one of the respondents in your video clip suggested. We actually need to really be informed about this at all scales now. And also our governments need to be very seriously involved in committing to adaptation, both finance towards adaptation, but also following through the implementation of these adaptation strategies and options, connecting these to risk, comprehensive risk management plans, and new ways of thinking about how we govern under a sort of new climate smart world.
Tim, Emily there was just talking about adaptation and implementation. I'm curious from your perch there, how does all this play into, the concept of disaster management? I mean, are we going to see particular protocols or codes of conduct set up more and more in order to make things safer for populations around the world in dealing with these extreme weather events?
Well, to be honest, those sorts of steps have been happening for some years already. There are various frameworks for disaster risk management. I think what's going on at the moment is that the field of disaster risk management, like dealing with floods and earthquakes and things like that, is increasingly becoming connected to climate change adaptation. They are no longer separate fields. And this is partly because people are now focusing more upon who is vulnerable and why to these events. Like maybe 30 years ago, 20 years ago, when we talked about adaptation, we usually talked about physical infrastructure to, for example, stop sea level rise affecting low-lying land. Nowadays, we're talking more about adaptation in the sense of diversifying land use, so that, for example, if land does get inundated by floods or rising sea levels, then it doesn't necessarily hurt the people who live there because they have other ways to get a living. Now, all of that will require much more of a sort of engagement with economic change and education and opportunities for people in certain parts of the world which are at risk from floods to have jobs or opportunities in other areas where there are not so many risks like that. So what's happening there is a gradual process of integrating disaster risk management with economic planning at the national level. And I think that's already happening.
Emily, I saw you reacting to some of what Tim was saying, and it looked to me like you wanted to jump in, so go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's also referring back both to what Tim is saying about many actions and activities have been developing already, but also something Simon said earlier about we don't necessarily see extreme events leading to action or social mobilization. But I think this is an area that we need to understand much more about, because we do see emergence of social movement. We do see the youth groups. We do see the emergence of Greta, for example, and engagement and people being interested in issues around sustainability and issues of climate change increasingly. So I'm wondering there that perhaps, these events are having an effect on a momentum of social engagement. Maybe it's not fast enough, maybe it's on a small scale, but we need to understand better if that is actually happening.
Simon, overall, how prepared do you think countries around the world are to deal with these calamities that have been brought about by extreme weather events?
Well, I think it really varies between countries. It really varies within countries. You see it even here where I live in British Columbia, Canada. Parts of the province were very prepared for the extreme heat and for fires. Other parts were not. And that variance from place to place is what's really worrisome. To me, one of the core parts of the Paris Climate Agreement was not just to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to avoid 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees of warming, but was to mobilize funds to help the developing world respond to climate change. And that is an area where the developed world has really been failing.
Emily, what do you think? Do you think that the upcoming landmark climate conference, COP26, that this inequity will actually be addressed? I mean, do you think that the richer countries will actually start helping poorer countries in battling climate change, in giving them the resources they need in order to either fight climate change and global warming or to adapt to it?
Yeah, well, one would hope so. However, I mean, I think there's a challenge now also with the COVID situation. And we've just seen, for example, the United Kingdom cutting back on its international aid budget. So I think we're giving different signals here in terms of the commitment to support developing countries in adapting to climate change. So I'm a little bit worried about that at the moment.
I mean, Simon, I saw you nodding there as well, so I want to ask what exactly you wanted to say in response to Emily. But I also want to follow up with, in talking about COP26. I mean, do you think that all of these warnings will finally start being heeded when it comes to that conference? I mean, will there be more of an impetus to actually change the behaviors of countries around the world so the carbon emissions can be reduced?
Well, I think the changing government in the United States, and also promises that have come from China, promises that have come from Canada, Korea, et cetera, in the new plan released by the EU, it does seem like there's been a big shift in the past year on the willingness to really go for deep emission cuts in the next 30 years. Now, putting some of that into practice is going to be challenging, but I do think you're going to hear a bit of a different tone at COP26. Than at some previous meetings, with the caveats that so many countries are deeply struggling through the pandemic that asking for big outlays of money right now may be challenging.
Tim, on a more fundamental level, we've spoken about trying to adapt to this. We've spoken about things that needed to be implemented by governments around the world. But how do you shift behaviors so that people are less vulnerable when these types of events happen? I mean, what kind of steps need to be taken in order to do that?
Well, there could be various types of education. Like we could use models from the past of educating people about other health risks like smoking or things like that. But basically, I think there has to be a multi-level approach, talking about how individuals can also take responsibility. Simon talked about the heat pumps, for example, as an alternative to natural gas. I think there is a growing market for that. In London, in particular, we have a shift in the last few years away from old gasoline-type engines and diesel towards electric cars. And I think this is a big shift. And this is partly driven, as Emily was saying, by a growing social mobilization around this issue. So basically, education and publicity, but also getting the message across. Adaptation doesn't have to be a loss. It doesn't have to be a impetus upon people to lose something, but it's actually a positive thing. That you're getting a better quality of life, and it's all part of living in the world as is happening at the moment. So education programs, but also government schemes to allow people to understand what needs to be done, and then giving them possibly incentives to do so. That sort of stuff.
Emily, we've spoken a lot during this conversation about things that need to happen, improvements that need to be made in different parts of the world in order to combat climate change. I want to ask you if there are some places where they are getting it right, if there are some bright spots out there, that could teach the rest of us a lesson, on how to really combat climate change and how to deal with the environment.
Yeah, well, I think there's plenty of examples out there. There's a lot of work going on in the C40 cities initiatives, and cities like Malmö in Sweden, for example, have been doing a lot in terms of greening infrastructure and creating sort of protection from sea level rise and so on. But I guess I wanted to add is that this is not an easy solution. This is not a one-stop shop. there's going to have to be a lot of direction here, but also engagement from people in general. And I think that in this regard, we have to remain resilient in this change, in these transformations that we're going to have to face, and to be able to recognize the challenge of it, and to recognize that it's a large and challenging situation that we find ourselves in. So I would like to say that there are more beacons of light out there. Maybe my colleagues Tim and Simon have other examples. I think that whether or not there are examples around the world that we can look towards, we certainly need to scale these up on a very big scale now, and have a real commitment to that scaling up.
Tim, let me throw the question to you as well. I mean, are there some examples out there of cities or countries that are getting it right, that are setting an example for the rest of us?
Well, getting it right is a very positive way of talking about things. I think there are various cities that are already taking important steps and could do a lot more. I know, for example, that the city of Amsterdam, for example, which of course is very low-lying next to the sea, has taken various steps to change the planning of the city to deal with multiple aspects of sustainability at the same time, like waste management, traffic management, energy management, all those things at the same time. In concerning the actual physical management of risks, well, in Southeast Asia, for example, Singapore is usually a good example of a city that has a better standard of dealing with things like flooding than other cities like Bangkok. Bangkok is in a difficult situation because it's at the bottom of a big river and it's at the top of a big bay, and therefore such locations like New Orleans, for example, will flood occasionally. But Singapore, on the other hand, really does have a quite proactive attitude towards infrastructure, such as having deep drains to deal with flash floods when they happen. And even though infrastructure like that is relatively simple, I think it can be copied by other cities.
Simon, this past week, there was a new study that was published by the journal Nature saying that portions of the Amazon rainforest are now releasing more carbon dioxide than they absorb. How worrying is that to you, and how devastating of an impact could that have?
It is something that, when we're doing the accounting of this, the causes of climate change, where the carbon dioxide is coming from, we're around 85 to 90% at this point is coming from fossil fuel burning, not, with the rest largely coming from deforestation. And that number has been, the fraction that's coming from fossil fuel burning has been going up over time, largely because we've increased fossil fuel burning so much, not that we've decreased deforestation by that much. And the problem is that a lot of countries are banking on their forests to absorb some of the carbon dioxide from fossil fuel burning and whatnot. And as we see the impacts of climate change affect forests, it's happened here in Canada where we've had obviously quite bad forest fires this year and in some previous years, but also pest outbreaks that have hurt our forests. That affects the carbon balance of the forests and affects government assumptions about what level of emissions from fossil fuels are going to be allowable to hit the target you're aiming for. And so, the data from the recent data from the Amazon is really just pointing to the importance of cutting emissions from all other means.
And Simon, we just have a little less than a minute left. Let me just ask you this. We've heard so many warnings from scientists over the years, and we're seeing so many warning signs right now. From your perspective, just how dire is the overall situation right now?
To me, the message and the math of this is really simple. The more we emit, the more the planet warms and the more people suffer. And we've been seeing that in the past few weeks around the world, and that's why it's so important to work to reduce emissions.
All right. Well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Tim Forsyth, Emily Boyd, and Simon Donner. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see this and all of our previous programs again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.